So first of all, thanks everybody. I can see there's about 40 of us on the call at the moment, which is fantastic. So thank you for taking the time really to tune into the webinar. That's fantastic and much appreciated. For those who haven't met me, my name is Nina Schönberg, and I am the coordinator for the NRN project, which these webinars are obviously a part of. So this webinar is the first session in a second event of webinars. So we had our first series of webinars last year in April. So we do indeed have a second session coming up next week, which I will touch upon a little bit more at the end of these sessions. I'll share the details for you. As always, just a little bit of housekeeping. Apart from the talks, we are also hosting a bit of Q&A or a panel at the end, and we'll also be launching a couple of Slido surveys throughout the day. We trialed this last year and it worked quite well, so I'm hopeful that it won't fail us this time around, and we hope that the use of Slido will help us kind of engage with the audience a little bit more, and obviously hear from you in terms of your views and opinions. And obviously that will then aid us to kind of think about how we might take kind of our work forward going ahead. And all the responses to those are anonymous as well. In terms of the Zoom webinar setup that we're using today, it means that only the hosts and the panelists or the presenters have their cameras and mics on. I do apologize for this, and I know it was part of some of the feedback last year, came across and explained that it was a little bit of shame that it wasn't, there was not as much engagement, I guess, from the audience, but just due to the sheer numbers of us on the call today and with the kind of nature of the event, it's just not really practical, unfortunately, to bring attendees onto the screen individually, or to use breakout rooms, as we really want your full attention. So I do encourage you, however, to use the chat functionality to chat amongst yourselves, to share links and to raise questions and have a conversation. And obviously, if you have any issues as well, please put those into the chat. We have a fantastic co-host here behind the scenes, Rosie, who will endeavor to do her best to help you out if you have any issues with the technology in particular. When using the chat, like I said at the beginning, do make sure that you select who you're sending your messages to, because the automated system will, I think, has set it up as panelists and hosts. So if you want to share your messages to everybody, make sure that you choose the everyone option, which should be in the drop-down menu next to the to message. We are recording the sessions, and we'll be sharing the links with all the attendees, but with the wider public as well later on. So if you do have any concerns about this, do let me know. You'll find my details at the very end of the day, and so just get in touch with me. More than happy to chat through that. If we do have any tweeters in the room, please do use the hashtag Nature Recovery Networks NI and tag us in on NRN_NI into your tweets so that we can interact with you throughout the day. And obviously, who knows, they will be trending by the end of the day. When it comes to then posing questions as part of the Q&A, use the Q&A functionality for that rather than the chat, so that you should be able to find those two separate functions at the bottom bar. Again, obviously, considering that there's quite a few of us on the call, there's a chance that we won't be able to go through all of the questions. So please, there should be an option there once questions start coming through to basically there's a thumbs up icon. So please use that to kind of upvote questions. So that will obviously give us an idea of kind of the most pressing questions that we should be aiming to go through when we get to the Q&A. While the format of this webinar for those who attended last year is very, very similar, we have made a few slight changes. So namely, that's been really to kind of allow you to interact with myself, so the NRN project staff, just considering that obviously last time around, we were quite in early stages in our project, and obviously we've now got a lot more to chat about. So this means that I will be able to join the panel during the Q&A as well. And for this, we are really delighted to welcome Dr. Catherine Duigan, I've pronounced it correctly, to host the Q&A. So if Catherine, you could give us a little wave and hi, that would be great.
Morning.
Excellent, thank you. So some of you might remember Catherine from actually the webinars last year. So Catherine is an independent consultant, an honorary professor of environmental science at Aberystwyth University, and a freshwater biological association fellow. So she spent a large part of her career in government agencies on the provision of evidence to support policy and operations. So she will be extremely well placed really to guide us all through the conversation session. So we are really, really pleased to have her on board. So to get us started, really, I think what would be great would be to get a little bit of interaction from the audience. So what we'll do is that we'll launch the first Slido poll. So what we've done, we've prepared this Slido link. For those who are not familiar with Slido, there's a few ways for you to be able to interact with the Slido. So basically, fingers crossed this works, and we should be able to get the responses real time on the screen. And I see somebody's already gotten there. So there's a few ways. Either if you have a smartphone, you can basically scan the QR code on your camera, which should then pop up the link. Alternatively, you should be able to see a link hopefully shortly in the chat from Rosemary, which will bring you there as well. Or the last option for you is to go to slido.com, and then you can put the NRN_NI_1 into the enter code here, which should be a bar at the very top. And you can actually, I don't recommend you to leave the link open for later on as well, because we've got another Slido coming up. So obviously the first question is really to get an idea of how many of us actually are new to these conversations and how many of us actually attended the sessions last year already. So seems like we've got quite a few new people on the call, which is great. Getting the message out there to new people, which is fantastic. A good quarter or 50% then has attended at least one or more of the sessions last year as well, but nobody has tuned into the recordings. Okay, so it's quite a sort of 50-50 of people, completely new people or people who would have attended few or more of those sessions last year. Excellent. Right, we might move on. Thank you for those of you who responded. So, and I do apologize, there might be a little bit of repetition for those 50% who obviously attended the sessions last year. But I'll do just a little bit of a recap on the project and kind of why it is that we are talking about nature recovery networks in the first place. So basically, since September 2020, with generous funding from the National Heritage Lottery Fund, RSPB and Ulster Wildlife, National Trust and Woodland Trust, in the spirit of what we call the Landscape Conservation Partnership, we have been working together on this capacity building project, which is all really about how can we bring about nature recovery networks in Northern Ireland and build capacity around that. As part of the project, we have been looking at evidence, which Gemma will be touching upon in terms of the mapping. But beyond this, we've also been exploring kind of potential delivery avenues, working on case studies and kind of looking at how this all could look like in practice, as well as facilitating knowledge sharing, which is obviously why we are all here on the call today. But why is it that we're talking about nature archive networks in the first place? So I can probably assume that most of us, if not all on the call today, know that habitat loss and fragmentation are one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss globally and locally. And we've probably all heard about the recent depressing statistic from the Natural History Museum and RSPB, which placed Northern Ireland at 12th worst in the world when it comes to biodiversity loss. So clearly, there is a bit of not just a bit of a premise for rethinking how we look after our environment going forward. So fundamentally, what was originally called ecological networks as a concept represents this sort of culmination of insights, you could say, towards addressing conservation needs effectively. And in particular, the approach really aims to ensure that, one, critical areas are being protected, biodiversity is being looked after at a landscape scale, or at least at regional scale. It has also emphasis on what we would call ecological coherence. So this is especially kind of through delivering connectivity between habitats and sites, and making sure also that these important areas for biodiversity are really kind of being buffered from the effects of damaging activities that might be happening in the surrounding landscape. I guess what is really the key in here is working towards this network of ecologically important areas that are functionally and not just structurally, so physically there, connected. While in some countries, such as the Netherlands and Estonia, and in the Netherlands we actually heard from last year, the work has really been underway since as far back as the 1990s. It's really in the sort of last couple of years that this has gained wide-scale momentum and policy support in the UK and in some parts of the south of Ireland as well. And this has been largely kind of driven by this landmark report from 2010 called Making Space for Nature, which was produced by Sarah Lawton and his colleagues. And it really kind of put in black and white, I guess you could say, that our current approach towards looking after our environment just isn't enough to safeguard biodiversity, and how we really need to bring about more, bigger, better, and more connected spaces of nature. And some of you might have heard of these being referred to as the Lawton principles. So what this all means in simple terms, and you'll probably see this illustration there on the right a few times across the different presentations today, is really to get an understanding of where do we have our core areas. So these are our existing protected areas and our priority habitats. Where do we have, and also where could we have, corridors and stepping stones in between these that would link them up, where restoration and habitat creation could take place to either eventually become core area in their own right or act as a corridor or a stepping stone. And then also going back to the kind of buffering, how could we actually buffer these areas from these external impacts? And then more widely, how does the wider landscape then, how could we make that more permeable for wildlife to travel through or live in, making these areas what we call sort of sustainable use areas. So the thinking behind this is that if we had this functional ecological network, as if a part or the whole network was kind of being hit by an unexpected pressure, it should be able to face this without basically collapsing and So this would mean that we would kind of be bringing about resilience in the long term so that they're able to withstand these sort of pressures and changes. So since this report, 2010 report that I referred to on the previous slide, in the kind of last decade, so since 2010, we've also had kind of further evolution on the thinking. So kind of moving away from just talking purely about ecological networks. We've started to acknowledge that as much as the primary role of these networks should really be about supporting biodiversity, we should also be highlighting where there's additional opportunities to deliver joint benefits for people. So looking at the ecosystem services, that is probably quite a familiar term to many of us on the call. So thinking about if we were to restore and create habitats, you know, what are the opportunities for the likes of flood alleviation, you know, access for people, adaptation and mitigation for climate change and so on, and kind of starting that conversation on nature-based solutions as well. And this is obviously then what has been termed nature networks or nature recovery networks rather than ecological networks. And that's kind of why we've adopted this as our kind of a working concept for this particular project rather than the pure ecological networks approach. So what it is exactly that we've been up to since the first webinars last year as a project. So while COVID obviously has hindered us in some ways, so obviously these webinars, for example, were originally supposed to be in-person conferences. There's been a lot that obviously modern technology has enabled us to do. And obviously, I might even argue that in some ways, you know, having moved these kind of knowledge sharing events online has potentially even kind of broadened our kind of networks and scope compared to the kind of olden ways that we might have worked with before. We'll obviously be hearing about some of these aspects from our speakers that will follow me. So I won't touch upon those too much, but obviously beyond the kind of mapping work, there's been a few sort of, which has obviously been kind of the core element of the project. There's been a lot more going on as well. A big part of this has been kind of this ongoing expanding and understanding of the concept, what has been happening elsewhere, but also what could this all look like here in Northern Ireland. So kind of exploring what sort of work is already underway, not just elsewhere in the UK and Ireland, but also in Northern Ireland as well, that could be kind of contributing towards our thinking about NRNs, and to kind of start understanding how we can, where do we have gaps in our knowledge and so on. So a lot of this has involved organizing, attending meetings and webinars, visiting other initiatives we can learn from and so on. So I've just put a few kind of examples here on the screen of what we've been up to. So for example, this picture there on the top left is from our visit to Fingal County Council, where we went to with Arton North Down Borough Council. Some of you might remember Hans from our second session last year. And so we traveled down with them, which was an extremely eye-opening trip, in fact. We've got a picture here of us up in Belfast Hills, learning from the nature-friendly farming network. We've got kind of us at conferences and events, us chatting amongst ourselves on Zoom, as you always do. And this last one here is really about kind of then, based on all of this, kind of collating our kind of learnings and know-how. And what we did was that we produced this kind of a suite of briefing notes, which we made available on the Ulster Wildlife NRN landing page, which are downloadable there. And another big part really about the project has been kind of working together as the 4 partner organizations and kind of bringing a bit together this expertise across the partners to discuss different topics and different aspects of the NRN work. With this in mind, we, for example, have brought together staff into these sort of like working groups to look at some of the focal areas, namely the potential roles of local authorities and future agricultural policy in NRN delivery, which goes back to those case studies that I mentioned earlier on. And I'll touch upon these a little bit more at the second session. And like I said, kind of based on all of this, kind of compiling all this information together, which obviously will be kind of a big part of our kind of final reporting in terms of recommendations going forward. I guess you could say that overall at this point in time, we are at the stage now where we have quite a good understanding of obviously what the issues are. And we're starting to have an idea of really what the actual solutions might be. So I would argue that kind of what is needed now is really that defining of the kind of destination of where we want to get to, just like we did with climate change, which is obviously net zero. And obviously this should be all about, you know, having more nature than we have available today. In terms then of today's aim and what we are here on this particular call today, we have a wonderful set of presenters who will be telling us about some of the developments in the past year in a little bit more detail, some of the stuff that I've touched on just now, as well as kind of giving us a bit of a status update of where we are at this point in time with NRNs in Northern Ireland. We've asked each of our speakers to give a bit of an overview of their work area, and we'll also ask them to kind of touch upon kind of keys for success as well as biggest challenges for delivery for NRNs in Northern Ireland, to help us to really kind of start that conversation and continue really that conversation of where we might go next. So we are indeed super grateful to have all of our wonderful presenters on the call. So I really do appreciate you all taking the time from your busy schedules. But in terms of the audience, with that in mind, you know, be prepared to ask questions and make sure to kind of utilize this opportunity to learn from them by asking questions. And obviously, like I said, I will be joining the panel myself as well in case you have any more project specific questions at the end. So I will try my best really to keep us on schedule today so that we can all get out for lunch on time. So just a reminder to the speakers, and I've warned you already before, that I'll be giving a bit of a kind of a 2-minute warning before your time might be running out, just ahead of that, just to make sure that we know where we're at and to keep us all kind of on schedule. So without further ado, I shall stop my screen sharing and I shall let Jane take the lead and share her screen. And in the meantime, I will give a quick introduction to Jane. So Dr. Jane Clark, she works at RSPB and She holds a PhD in marine spatial planning and climate change from Queen's University Belfast. Jane works as the Nature Protection Policy Officer, and she has a broad focus really, which kind of stretches from protected areas to spatial planning more widely. And she will be giving us a bit of a recap on basically where we are in terms of policy when it comes to NRNs in Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Jane is in fact actually not able to join the panel later on. So what we've done is that we've kind of switched things around just slightly, which means that she will do 15 minutes of of a presentation and 15 minutes of a Q&A right after her session. So Catherine will take a lead on that. So in terms of Jane, if you have any questions for her, be prepared to come up with them already during her talk, which is obviously going to just begin now. So feel free, Jane, to take the stage, and I will mute myself and have somebody else the opportunity to talk.
Perfect, thank you very much. And just to check, you can see my screen. Yes, perfect, great. The joys of technology, you can never be sure. So yeah, morning all. Thank you very much, Nina, for having me along. As Nina said, RSPB and I has been part of this landscape partnership, and I suppose we've been looking at where the policy is going, as well as I suppose the practical reality of delivering a nature recovery network on land. So yeah, so as Nina said, I'm going to do a sort of a quick whistle stop tour of the policy arena for nature recovery networks in Northern Ireland. But to do that, we've got to take a bit of a step back and think, ooh, this is where I hope my slides move on. There we go. Yeah, you know, we understand what the concept of a nature recovery network is, or an ecological network. We understand what they mean. And as Nina said, you'll probably see this image a couple of times through the presentations. And here's your first repetition. So we know what they are. We know that they aim to create that more joined up aspect of our protected sites and our best areas for nature. So that's better, bigger, and more joined up. But I suppose there's a question there of what comes first, the practice or the policy. You know, we're seeing examples like the landscape partnership event or the landscape partnership work that's doing nature recovery networks in practice and looking at a big scale, at that macro scale, as to where a nature recovery network could and should be. And we're seeing a lot of examples of different local authorities across Northern Ireland, the Republic, and across the UK that are taking it forward. But there's still that policy gap and that legislative gap in Northern Ireland in particular that isn't driving a coherent approach. And ultimately, if we want a nature recovery network, we need to be working on a all island basis. We can't be working in individual local authority level. And so that means we need to step away from this sort of siloed thinking and the siloed decision making, and looking at nature recovery networks as a real motivator and a catalyst for collaborative and coherent decision making across all aspects of policy, whether that's agriculture, infrastructure, whatever it is. There needs to be that better coherence. But it also then needs to go across all levels of government. There has to be a drive by central government. There has to be a motivation, obviously, at the local authority level, but then it also has to cover, you know, our global commitments and how we're going to deliver them on land. And obviously, at the end of the day, policy and strategies are one thing, but we need to resource this. This means that bodies on the ground, like the Landscape Partnership and other NGOs, as well as landowners and land managers, are being paid for recovering nature and providing those public services and public goods. But ultimately, we need this enabling framework for everyone to work from. And it's that framework of policy and of legislation that's really worth sort of delving into briefly. There we go. So yeah, so looking elsewhere, sort of set the context of where Northern Ireland is in relation to the rest of the UK and Ireland. So I suppose the concept of nature recovery networks in the UK, I suppose really took off in DEFRA's 25-year environment plan. That is their long-term plan for improving nature. And following that, through the Environment Act, they legislated for local nature recovery strategies. And that requires local authorities across England to develop up local nature recovery strategies that will come together and form a wider nature recovery network across England. So we've then also seen developments coming through their green paper, where they've talked about the linking up between 30 by 30 commitments, so the commitment to protect 30% of land by 2030, their protected sites network specifics, where local nature recovery strategies fit within that, as well as sort of delivery mechanisms such as biodiversity net gain and a nature for climate fund. In Scotland, there's also a lot of work going on. So they're currently consulting on sort of landscape scale restoration, including local nature networks. They're also in the process of developing up their next biodiversity strategy, and it's expected that a nature bill will come sometime in the next parliamentary period. So that would be the nature bill to underpin the nature recovery networks and wider restoration targets in law, so creating a strong statutory duty for all public authorities to act. In Wales, the situation is somewhat similar, However, they do have statutory guidance that says that I think it's local authorities must work to develop resilient ecological networks. And again, you know, we could get bogged down into the micro of what's the difference between an ecological network and a nature recovery network. And there are subtle differences, but ultimately they're about those same principles: better, bigger, and more joined up. Again, in Wales, they're doing a big biodiversity deep dive at the moment. So I think their Minister for Climate Change is carrying out a deep dive into different aspects of biodiversity. So again, they're looking at their global commitments, such as the 30 by 30 and wider sort of sustainable agriculture policies, and looking at nature recovery targets in law. And again, there is that commitment to a nature bill in the next Senate period. In the Republic of Ireland, again, this is where that subtle language change is seen. We're seeing in their biodiversity action plan up to 2021 that they talk about ecological networks. And we know that they're in the process of developing their new biodiversity strategy. And I know just last week, or just this week, I think actually, no, last week, yes, the conference held by the government to start off the conversation really about biodiversity strategy, and nature recovery networks was a concept that frequently came up. And it was brought up alongside, again, delivery mechanisms such as net gain, and how the planning system would play a role. And we also know that for the Republic of Ireland, there will be, I think towards the end of this year, an EU restoration law. And that will be, again, that underpinning, binding statutory duty to restore nature at habitat and species level. So a real broad focus. But we know that's obviously sort of held up at the moment. So what does it mean in Northern Ireland? So I suppose nature recovery networks in Northern Ireland have been discussed or formally committed to within the environment strategy. So the environment strategy for Northern Ireland is our first environmental improvement plan. And what that means is basically it's a statutory duty, it's a legal requirement for DAERA and other departments to set out the steps that they're going to take to improve the environment. And this comes out of the Environment Act that we're a part of. So in it, there's a very specific commitment to nature recovery plans and nature recovery networks, which is great. And you'll see it there. It talks about, you know, nature-based solutions, that habitats and species priority. It is that bigger focus of not just looking at just the nature aspect, but how this can be part of nature and climate resilience. But ultimately, there's 225 actions in that plan or in the strategy, but a number of them lack coherence and lack a specific binding target. So they're not time set. And so there's an issue that whilst we have these big commitments, there's no real framework or a timeline for progressing action. And the coherence thing is one real issue. Ultimately, at the heart of nature recovery networks is that looking to a linked up and collaborative approach. So that means we need to have policy going in the right direction across agriculture, across fisheries, across public transport, across everything, but we're not seeing that. So we're not seeing the fact that you know, to ultimately to get a nature recovery network, we need to deal with some of the bigger issues that we're facing on the ground in Northern Ireland, such as ammonia pollution. Some of our SPAs are at 500% their critical loading level for nitrates. And that's really a fundamental issue that we need to deal with before we can even consider looking at that sort of wider scale landscape recovery. However, when I talk about those 225 targets, that is the draft strategy. So the draft strategy was consulted on, I think, February this year, or it was closed in February. And just before the Assembly closed down for the election period, Minister Putz did approve the final draft or the final version of the strategy. However, because this is a cross-cutting strategy, it has to have formal executive sign-off. And therefore, because we don't have a functioning executive, the strategy cannot be formally adopted as a cross-executive strategy. So the final publication is hampered by the political situation. However, it is worth noting, again, a sort of subtle nuance in the Environment Act means that as of the 25th of July this year, when the provision commences, so when the requirement for DAERA to produce the strategy turns on, they have 1 year in which to produce it. So if, and touch wood, we're not in this situation, but if 1 year from the 25th of July, there is still no functioning executive, the strategy will be published. However, it won't be formally adopted by the executive. However, whilst we do have that issue that the strategy itself is not publicly available for us, there is that clear mandate for action across public authorities. This has been approved by the Minister in DAERA. So from our perspective, DAERA have a real mandate to get on and start, realising these policy commitments, but also joining up the policy commitments and making sure that we are looking at that macro scale. So what's the rush? Well, I say that obviously as a hypothetical. We know what the rush is. We are in a nature and climate crisis. As Nina said, we are 12th worst in the world for biodiversity loss in Northern Ireland, and that's shocking. We're famed for our stunning landscapes, but we're not doing enough to protect our iconic species. But there are a number of other things that are coming along in the pipeline that will really push forward nature recovery networks and where Northern Ireland is going to go. So the first to note is the Climate Change Act 2022. So in it, there's a requirement for nature-based solutions targets. So again, that legal requirement to have nature-based solutions is amazing, and it's a really good step forward, but it needs to be realised. We need to see an action plan coming forward in the next year that sets out a clear plan across Northern Ireland for how we're going to realise these targets. As I said, there's the EU Restoration Law. So obviously that will apply to the Republic of Ireland. And that's a real opportunity that we should be grasping in Northern Ireland as well. That provides a real catalyst for collaboration across a single biogeographic unit that we're in. And it allows us to have that sort of the binding targets pushing up from the Republic of Ireland and giving us something to really step forward to. We can do better when we can develop that nature recovery network on that real big macro scale. Obviously, we have COP15, so the Convention on Biological Diversity, which I suppose is the sister COP to COP26, the climate COP. And whilst there is still uncertainty as to when COP will happen, it is scheduled to happen, I think about September, October time this year in Kunming in China. However, it has been delayed for 2 years, and it is looking likely that it may be delayed again. But that isn't a reason for not acting. We know that the draft framework is sitting there, and key targets that will eventually apply to Northern Ireland are already fairly well known, such as 30 by 30. However, it's worth noting that 30 by 30 and nature recovery networks are not one and the same thing. Protecting 30% of land by 2030 is looking at those core protected sites, the best places for nature. Nature recovery networks allows us to do that joining up, that making the better connected sites across all of Northern Ireland. So ultimately, we need ambitious, coherent and directed action in Northern Ireland. We need to have an Environment Act for Northern Ireland that creates binding legal targets for nature's restoration across habitats and species. We need the policies in place that are coherent across agriculture, across fisheries, across land use, peatland, forestry, everything. We need a coherent approach to it. We then have to have the strategies and action plans to direct action, both across public authorities, but also to encourage that collaborative work between NGOs, landowners, land managers, and public authorities. But we also need to look at resourcing this nature recovery network. It is one thing to commit to something, it is another to resource it effectively. But we have to look at ensuring that any funding, whether it's private or public, that's coming into nature recovery networks is effectively creating change on the ground. So there's a need for a clear investment plan for Northern Ireland that looks at, well, what can we do when we invest in nature? And we know that it can produce numerous green jobs. It has proven benefit for ecosystem restoration in terms of flood prevention, water quality, air quality. They're all aspects that we're fundamentally reliant upon, but we need that resourcing, but it needs to be directed. And I sort of use the corncrake in the background as a good example of action that's already happening. RSPB has worked tirelessly in Rathlin Island, and we've now brought back from local extinction corncrake. And it's a good example of how action really does have an impact, but it only has an impact when we start doing it now. This next political mandate will take us up to around 2027, and that's almost towards the end of the 2030 decade, when we'll be required to meet a lot of our global commitments, and nature needs action now. So let's get to it, get acting. But as I said, there's still a lot of gaps that need to be worked on. But yes, thank you very much. And as Nina said, unfortunately, I can't stay for the panel, but I'm more than happy to take any questions now. And if you have any questions that come after, please feel free to send me an email, and I'm more than happy to chat. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. I would again repeat the encouragement to put some questions in our Q&A box, but I'd like to come back to a couple of the points that Jane made. So you've explained to us about the crucial 25th of July date, and if an executive is not in place a year after that, that the strategy will be published. I'm just wondering how much insight you have into the content and how things could be moved along in the interim period. In particular, how much cross-cutting work could be done?
Yeah, so I suppose in terms of, we haven't obviously seen a draft or an approved version of the strategy since Minister Pitts approved it in, I think, sort of March time. And I suppose that's a real concern that, you know, we know a lot of work was done by the department on this strategy. And I know that there was a massive response from stakeholders across Northern Ireland. But I suppose because we don't know what's there, we don't know how much it's improved. You know, there could be a real good strategic framework now in that strategy that we could be promoting and we could be actively talking about and we could be, you know, realizing now. But until it's published, we don't know. I suppose, you know,
safe choices or safe directions. Do you have that kind of insight?
Pardon?
You've any enough insight to say, well, if we work on this particular issue together, it's bound to contribute.
In terms of getting the strategy published or realizing the nature recovery networks?
Realizing the networks eventually.
I mean, I suppose it's one of those things, because we don't know what's in the strategy, we're not really sure where those cross-cutting areas are, but we continue to work off the draft strategy that we've seen. And that's where I suppose we've been pulling out the fact that there is that lack of coherence. So, for example, we still don't have an ammonia strategy, and having an ammonia strategy that effectively reduces the level of nitrate pollution in a number of our protected sites, that's a really, not, I don't want to say it's not easily solved. It's a challenge. We know it's a challenge, but it's something we know that would have direct beneficial impact on realizing those bigger picture nature restoration aspects. So that's, I suppose, where we've been focusing our kind of advocacy and our work on and looking at, well, if that's the draft and we assume, you know, we hope it has got better, but we can't assume that because we haven't seen it. Yeah, we're still targeting those aspects that we know are either missing and we're missing in the previous executive and pushing for them to come up this season. But I suppose also what's worth recognizing is that so the Office for Environmental Protection, which is the new government watchdog that was formed out of the Environment Act, is now fully functioning in Northern Ireland. And they have a monitoring responsibility amongst many of their functions. They monitor the implementation of the environment strategy. So we are pushing on both sides for them to talk to DAERA and for DAERA to listen to the OEP to make sure that the strategy, whatever form it's in, is in its best form, but also to remind them that there is an oversight body watching. This isn't something that we can sort of, you know, put on the shelf and let it sit. There's a legal obligation to monitor it, and there's a legal obligation to implement it.
Okay, so you've obviously identified air pollution as one of the critical issues. Would you like to suggest some other topics? And I noted that you had a background in the marine environment, which often gets, you know, set aside as being a bit too complicated. So could you say what your other priorities might be, and do we need to do anything special for the marine environment?
Yeah, so in terms of other priorities, you know, I suppose that a lot of the discussion I've had today is about those sort of directed actions on the ground, but there are a number of areas sort of behind the scenes that need to be fixed and improved before we can go forward. So for example, condition monitoring for Northern Ireland's protected sites is not publicly available. So we don't actually know what true condition our sites are in. Now we have yearly statistic reports that come from DAERA that give us overarching percentages, but we can't tell where those specific features are in unfavorable condition. And so it's really difficult to target action on the ground. So you could have, you know, for example, certain features that are in favorable condition in one site, not favorable in the other. And there's fairly easy solutions to how you can bring them up to favorable condition. And a lot of that can also help drive collaboration between landowners and land managers, as well as NGOs. And then in terms of I suppose the marine one, this is where my background's marine, but we do have a marine specialist in our team, Dr. Kenny Biddles, and I know Anika is also a marine expert, so I would leave the specifics to them. But I think the one thing from my experience is that you're right, marine does frequently get sort of forgotten because it's seen to be something out there. It's seen to be away from us. It's not the direct and tangible, you don't go for a walk 200 nautical miles off sea. But what we know is that, there's these solutions for nature recovery networks on land. And in a way, it's almost easier to realize it on land because it's sort of one-dimensional, as in you have one plot of land. In the marine environment, you're talking multi-dimensional. You've got seabed uses, pelagic use, surface water use. So it's a lot more complicated. And so time does need to be dedicated to looking at what a nature recovery network would look like in the marine. And I think the simple thing that we know is that whilst about 38% of our marine area is designated, it is not protected effectively. So we're not meeting our targets in the marine environment. So designating more and more and more looks good in one way, but the actions that are needed, including respecting the fact that we have protected sites, is still absent.
Okay, so you talked about how there's going to be a really strong drive by central government. That's absolutely essential. But how does it trickle down to the local level, in your opinion? And does local politics hold that up?
Yeah, so I suppose it's looking at the fact that, for example, planning is devolved down to the local authority level in Northern Ireland. So that's where a number of really key decisions will have to be made to encourage that nature recovery network, because we need to have development that is in harmony with nature. So there's that real, I suppose, tangible example of how the local affects the national. But then in terms of the national impacting down, we need to have strategic approach so that between two authorities, you're not seeing different approaches to what a nature recovery network is. Because if you see different approaches, we're looking at England and Scotland, for example, that are developing up their sort of nature recovery network systems, and certain frameworks around it are adopting different approaches. So we're seeing across countries that is happening. And then if we don't have a strategic direction from our central government in Northern Ireland, local authorities may choose to go one way or another. And I don't think there's necessarily any specifically right direction at the moment. We know this project has been really good in terms of showing us that Northern Ireland scale and potential for priority habitat restoration. But you need to then have sort of a land use strategy that goes across all of Northern Ireland, that then is realised through different policies and different aspects, but also through those nature recovery networks. So I suppose it's sort of, again, it's that chicken and egg, right? So you've got some local authorities that are really keen and jumping on it. Some are maybe not so keen. So you need the encouragement to come down from central government, but you also need to have those resources and the support coming down from central government. Because if we are going to deliver it, we're going to need more resources across local authorities.
Okay. You have understandably a very strong focus on working with other stakeholders. That came over very clearly in your presentation, and that's completely understandable in an NGO community. Now, Peter has put a good question in the chat box around, raising the emphasis and understanding about habitat management, in particular in relation to mowing grass. And it just sparks an idea of what are you doing to sort of communicate the general value of nature to the wider public?
Yes, I think, environment in Northern Ireland has frequently been a sort of an afterthought. And, there's various reasons why that is the case. But we know that nature and the climate crisis are more and more frequently coming higher up the I suppose, preference or priority list for voters and for members of the public. We've done polling with Lucid Talk that has shown, 80+% want better laws for nature, 80+% want an EPA. We know that people want development in harmony with nature. They want action on wildlife crime. So it is there, but I think sometimes it's people not knowing necessarily what to say and to speak up. One of the biggest things that we can do to solve the nature and climate crisis is to talk about it, to talk about how we can solve it, and to talk about sort of the threats that we're facing. And we do a lot of work, RSPB in particular does a lot of work with schools and education and community outreach. And we work with groups across the country that are so passionate and so driven to restore nature in their little community, and if you have more and more of them, then it all joins up and they become their own recovery network of volunteers. And Ulster Wildlife and National Trust and Woodland Trust are the same. We're all reaching out and trying to talk to people. And I think politicians need to hear that, because ultimately, if politicians think they can get away, or civil service thinks they can possibly get away with not doing certain things to improve nature, they might do it. But if we're loud and we're vocal, so we've seen rallies for the climate change, for COP26 and for the Climate Change Act. We've seen a mass mobilization of sort of civil society so far. But yeah, the more and more we can reach out, and the more people can then talk up, then I think that's when we're going to get that change, because nothing changed the minds of a politician like the voters' preference.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to be sitting here today and making a very tiny contribution to nature conservation in Ireland. So please forgive this question. Where would you say nature recovery networks sit when it comes to looking at the island or Ireland as one biogeographical unit? And what sort of policy implications might this have in terms of cross-border cooperation?
Yeah, so I mean, environment is one of the core themes of the Good Friday Agreement. We know it's our greatest shared asset across the island of Ireland. And we know it provides opportunities for peace building, it provides opportunities for job development, for growth of communities, there's so many opportunities. I think Nature Recovery Networks is potentially one of those tangible examples of how we can step up and do more about that cross-border collaboration. Because as you said, we're in a single biogeographic unit. We know nature doesn't adhere to geopolitical boundaries. And so we have to start thinking on that broader scale. As I pointed out, there's obviously this forthcoming EU restoration law, and that should drive strategic action in the Republic of Ireland. But we know that so many of our most protected sites are across the border. So if we have action in one half and no action in the other, it's not a waste of time, but it's, the environment is not determined solely by where it is in one place. It's determined by that landscape scale management and landscape scale activities. So we have to realize that you have to look beyond the border, and you have to look beyond, ultimately we're part of a single biogeographic unit that runs the whole way from Spain up to Norway, and that's the sort of scale we should be looking at. But definitely on the island of Ireland, it's that need to sort of say, this is our greatest shared asset. It's what binds all of us together, and we need to act to protect it, and also to maximize where we can, build on it in terms of peace and reconciliation and green jobs and community development.
Okay, thank you, Jane. We have quite a specific question from Judy. Are EFS group projects de facto nature recovery networks?
Good question. So again, I'm not an agriculture expert, so I'm only going to go off what I do know the knowledge I've gained from working very closely with our conservation officer, Katie Gibb, in the Antrim Hills, where we have an EFS group scheme for breeding waders. And if anyone's been able to click on, we had our curlew cam. I think it's finished now, but we had a camera up there showing a curlew nest, and we had tiny cute little fluffy chicks, which, don't get me wrong, love policy, but there's nothing better than a cute fluffy curlew chick. And through that work with the group EFS scheme, we've been able to work with the farmers to develop really, really good relationships that's allowed us to do active management for breeding waders. That's curlew, snipe, redwing, red shank and lapwing. Producing my own species here. So there's really good examples of where it's working. But I wouldn't necessarily say it's a de facto nature recovery network, because nature recovery network is that bigger scale. So unless you had an EFS scheme, EFS across all of Northern Ireland really working, that would be where you would have that nature recovery network. And rather than just sort of very enclosed areas, that you have multiple sets of group schemes working together. again, I would defer to my agri experts on whether it really truly is part of it, but we know that there are examples of really good working relationships where EFS is working for nature, but we also know that there are challenges with the EFS program for farmers. So again, that coherence is that we need to have a new agriculture policy system that does create that nature recovery network, because agriculture and nature-friendly farming will be a key delivery mechanism in achieving a nature recovery network across Northern Ireland.
Okay, one final question. It always comes down to resources, and you mentioned the need for private and public funding. Is there any thought going into developing some sort of novel economic instruments to fund this in Northern Ireland?
So this is again where I'd have to probably defer to my environmental economic experts. So we know that, so RSPB has done a lot of work in terms of costing up what nature recovery would cost in Northern Ireland. And we have an investment plan that we want to promote and we want to get out, because there are examples, there's economic proof of job creation and then economic benefit from nature recovery. I suppose a really good example and a tangible example that comes to my head is our work that we've done up in the Garran Plateau on peatland restoration, where I think it was about £1 for every pound that was spent on restoration, £3.90 something was produced. And again, don't quote me on the facts, I'll send the link through. But we have really good evidence of where the money coming in is producing, I don't want to say 10 times, but significant more value on the outside. But that also then doesn't account for the value of biodiversity, because whilst you can cost up flood alleviation, water quality, etc., I know there are people who put costs to trees and costs to birds, but there's an intrinsic value that you can't capture. So there is examples of it happening in Northern Ireland, but again, we don't have that strategic approach from central government to fund nature. So we need a program for government and forgotten the word, but an investment plan essentially for Northern Ireland coming from central government that is channeling the right funds in the right direction. So for example, agriculture subsidies need to be channeled towards public goods for public money. We believe that farmers deserve to be paid for the public services that they're providing, and a nature recovery network is one of those delivery I suppose mechanisms, but also filters that can filter in that bigger scale rather than just looking at single farm recovery or single farm nature restoration. You're looking at that group scheme and that sort of wider, but there's definitely still a big gap there. And the sooner that Stormont can get up and running, the sooner we can get that investment plan and the sooner we can get that sort of strategic approach from central government. But there is always that opportunity for private investment. But again, it has to be done in a way that is targeted and led by the science and is robustly monitored and robustly reviewed, so that you don't just have money being, I suppose, piled into land that then is sort of forgotten about. So yeah, it's definitely still a gap in Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much, Jane. I'm going to hand back to Nina now.
Thank you so much both, and thanks so much, Jane, for the wonderful talk and well as responding to all of those questions. There was a lot coming through, so I appreciate all of those questions as well. And obviously, thanks so much for being so flexible as well in terms of shifting things around so flexibly. So I appreciate that very, very much. So
thank you very much, and I will leave you all. But as I said, more than happy to take questions by emails, and I'll pop my email into the chat, and I'll put some of the other links including the Valuing Our Peatlands work and the Biodiversity and Tax Index stuff. But thank you very much.
Excellent.
And your day, guys.
Thank you so much, Jane.
Thanks. Bye.
And I guess that there's a lot that we've already covered. So there's a lot I think that we can let sink in. So I think what we have on our agenda as well at the moment is to have a bit of a comfort break. So let's make sure that we all make ourselves some fresh cups of coffee and tea. And I shall put the screen back up. But basically, if I could ask us all to be back at 1:45, so in about 10-15 minutes, that would be great. And if you could put that time back in the chat, Rosemary, as well, that would be great. But yes, let's have a bit of a breather. Let's all let that sink in, and let's refresh with some coffee and tea, and I'll see you all back shortly in about 10 minutes or so, so 1:45. Thanks, everybody. Hi, everybody. It's 1:45, so I hope most of us are back on board with fresh cups of tea and coffee. I've just got a message there from Jane. She's unfortunately unable to share all her links in the chat because she got dropped off from the call. So I'll share those shortly. She's just sent them through. So I'll share those shortly in the chat. So we can get them all across to you. In the meantime, I might just bring us to the next Slido questionnaire, if I managed to get my screen moving on. Yes, basically what my thinking behind this question was to get a bit of an idea of, do you feel like you as an individual or the organization that you might work for, do you feel like you might have a role to play, either in terms of the actual delivery of NRNs on the ground, or the design, or even both? And if you feel like that's the case, what kind of ways might those be? So this question is really kind of a free text. So what that means that when you start basically writing your responses, they should start popping up on the screen. So basically you should be able to use the exactly same Slido link. And if Rosie, you wouldn't mind sharing that in the chat just in case again. Or again, you can go to slido.com and plot in the NRN _N_1. Or you can use the QR code. So I'll leave this there for just a couple of minutes to get some responses on the screen, and please, I would be really keen to hear from you. So let us know, where do you feel you might be able to play a role, and in what way might that be? And I can confirm that you can actually fill in, you should be able to fill in several responses as well if you have more than one response. Right, okay, this is fantastic. So a lot of different ways. Advocacy comes very highly. So basically, the more people say give us the same response, the bigger the words get on the screen. So it's quite interesting, actually, going back to what Jane was just talking about in terms of kind of the shared voice and the need for advocating coming really highly up there from you. So yeah, keep them coming. This is fantastic. Supporting evidence, partnering, funding. Oh, somebody has money. Actual kind of creation, on the ground creation, case studies. I like that the kind of collaboration and partnering up is coming up. Beelines, you know, just the importance of data, citizen science. You know, the role of nature reserves in all of this. The importance of volunteers going back to the kind of citizen science but a bit as well. Quite interesting, those kind of three big ones: advocacy, evidence, and data. Excellent. We might leave it there. Oh, I can see there's new comments coming up. Just to note as well, I might say that you should the link should be open for a little while. I think I said that it would close by the end of the day. So even if you have ideas after this, you can go and plop them in. So it's not just while it's on the screen, but the link should be open until the end of the day. So feel free to fill in any responses later on as well. Good practice, case studies, examples. These are great. Thank you so much. We might move on, just as we know that the next speaker should be super exciting in terms of kind of that mapping work that I have been referring to. So I'll stop sharing my screen. Hopefully, successfully. Stop sharing. There we go. So next up, we have Dr. Gemma Bell. Gemma has worked for 10 years as an environmental consultant with environment systems based in Aberystwyth in West Wales. Her background is in wetland ecology and soil science and earth observation mapping and monitoring of environmental processes. Today, her work largely focuses on ecosystem service and climate change modeling. So Gemma was the lead on the habitat network mapping project that we run. So the mapping work that I referred to earlier on. So she will be giving you all an introduction to this quite an exciting piece of work for Northern Ireland. So thank you very much, Gemma, for taking the time. So I'll give the floor to you. The floor is yours. And I see the fancy new RSPB logo there as well, which was just launched yesterday.
Thanks, Nina. I was just struggling to find my unmute button there. Joys of multiple screens. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you about actually how we created the habitat maps that Nina was talking about earlier in support of the delivering nature recovery networks for Northern Ireland. So I have a couple of background slides, and I know Nina's already discussed a lot of this already. You're going to see some familiar images, so I'm going to scan through this bit quite quickly. We all know by now the importance of biodiversity, and we all are all aware of the nature emergency or biodiversity crisis, and that this is a landscape scale problem. We can't just focus on small areas now. We have to think big and take action on a big scale. And this is why the Landscape Partnership Agreement is so important, because it provides a big opportunity to actually get things done at the scale that's required. Natural England has previously developed a methodology for creating nature recovery networks for England. And the idea was to use this as a starting point to develop the first networks for Northern Ireland, but make them specific for Northern Ireland, to make them work for the habitats and the context in Northern Ireland. So all of the fundamental components were there. So we have to think about the core habitats, the areas of good quality habitat where that provide a home for the characteristic species, be it woodland, be it bog, be it fen, be it grassland. But also we have to think about how the species move through the landscape. And of course, there's lots of other habitats that make this possible. If you're a woodland species, you make use of scrub. Grassland areas are important as well. So we have to think big. We don't just think about woodland, we have to think about all of the other supporting habitats as well. And that's what the networks do. We think about permeability, how a species moves through the landscape and how well these habitats are connected together. And so this is why with the Natural England NRNs, we end up with these classifications of different zones in the network. So we have the core areas that are called primary habitat, and then we have the associated habitats, which are habitats that are also important for the species within the primary habitats. Then we have the fragmentation action zone, which are areas of primary habitat, associated habitat, important areas of habitat that are not quite in close enough proximity to the core areas. So obviously from the Lawton report, we all know the importance of connectivity. So if a piece of habitat, if a patch is too isolated, it's not going to be much help for species wanting to disperse in terms of long-term resilience. So the fragmentation action zone identifies those patches of habitat that could be expanded upon to connect it better to the main network. And then we have areas of restorable habitat, where the habitat could actually be managed in a different way. It could be supported to develop into primary habitat. And then we have the network expansion zones and enhancement zones, which are areas, these consider proximity to the main primary and associated habitat areas, where the conditions could be very good for taking action to restore primary habitats that would give the greatest benefits in terms of providing increased connectivity throughout the landscape. And we can think of these as a form of prioritization. So the network expansion zone would be a good place to start. And then you've got the enhancement zones as well. Just thinking about what kind of level of landscape permeability do you want to create? Are you able to create in terms of where your friendly landowners are, where your land holdings are, and where perhaps you should focus your efforts for maximum effect. So the aims of this project really were to take the Natural England process as a basis and produce a suite of national habitat maps for Northern Ireland, but also local habitat networks for the case study area, which was Ard's and North Down, and also Belfast, where we took some more detailed data sets and produced slightly different models. And then we wanted to take the data and look at the ability for Northern Ireland to deliver on the 30 by 30 target to conserve 30% of the land for nature and biodiversity by 2030, and what the habitat networks could actually tell us about this ambition, how it could support it. So our very first task was to look at the priority habitat list, just to make sure, because we were taking this methodology from Natural England, we needed to make sure it was appropriate for Northern Ireland. So we had a good look at the priority habitats and the rule base, how the different habitats were defined and how the different parameters were defined for each of the networks to make sure they were suitable for Northern Ireland. Then we had a look at the data that was available. So we had a range of local data sets for Ard's and North Down and for Belfast. We had national data sets for Northern Ireland. And where possible, we also included data sets for the Republic, because we know that this, the species move across the border. They don't care about political boundaries. So our data availability for the Republic was quite limited, but where we had data for the Republic, we included that too. We then created the habitat networks and then carried out statistical analysis to see what kind of areas we were talking about with respect to the 30 by 30 ambition. So as a starting point, the Natural England methodology mapped a range of priority habitats and also grouped some of them together. So there was a grouped coastal habitat network, lowland, grassland, wetland and upland habitats. So for our project, we wanted to map the individual habitat networks, so for bog and heath. And again, we also produced a range of grouped habitat networks. So grouped wetland habitat types, grouped grassland habitat types, and the coastal ones and the woodland ones. So the first step was to look at the priority habitat list. And for many of the priority habitats, we found that the English definition was suitable for Northern Ireland, just with a few amendments then on the kinds of habitats we wanted to consider in support. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. What we did find was that the Natural England NRNs made distinctions between lowland and upland habitat types. And what we decided for Northern Ireland, we wanted to merge them together. So just to produce a single bog habitat network, a single heath habitat network. And we decided that it was really on the landscape scale, it was more important to show the connectivity between those different habitat types, because in terms of species movement, really functionally they're acting in the same way. There are a few extra habitats in Northern Ireland not present in England, like marl lakes, but we thought there was no reason why that should not be considered in the lake, the priority habitat type. And lowland calcareous grassland is a priority habitat type that was mapped by Natural England. It's not present in Northern Ireland, so we just use a single calcareous grassland network. So a few little decisions like that. Also notable that the Natural England did not produce a deciduous woodland network, only ancient semi-natural woodland network, but we decided that it was something that we really wanted to do for Northern Ireland, to produce a woodland network. So those were the main decisions. We decided to create the woodland network, merge the upland lowland habitat types. What would have been lovely to do would be to produce a habitat network map for including hedgerows, and field margins, for that data is not available. The data is quite piecemeal. It would be fantastic to have, but at the moment it's just not quite there yet. So this scary list, this is what makes the habitat networks happen. This is the schema mapper, which is essentially a rule base. It determines the rules, what gets included in the habitat networks and what doesn't. So on the list, on the left, we've got a list of the priority habitat types that we want to map. And then we have the alias. And then in that fourth column, associated habitats, that lists all of the different habitats, that the abbreviations that we're going to consider as associated habitat. So in that first row there, we've got ancient semi-natural woodland. And the main habitat type is ancient semi-natural woodland. But the associated habitats, things that really support that habitat well, are deciduous woodland, wood pasture and parkland, and traditional orchard. And then in the next column, it defines the habitat types that we will consider as restorable for that habitat. So in this case, it's plantation, ancient woodland. And then in the next column, this is actually a snapshot of an original rule base. It gives you options for places where habitat creation is happening. And then there are soil units in there, because we had access to soil data for Northern Ireland, and it defines the soil types that support the habitat type, because some habitats have very precise soil requirements, like calcareous grassland, like limestone pavement. Other habitats like deciduous woodland are not fussy. And so for most of the habitats, we had some preferred soil types. And then for other habitats, they were less constrained in terms of soil. Then we have a range of buffers, and some of these are just required to deal with spatial data, to cope with little gaps between polygons, things like that. And some of them are very important in identifying clusters of habitats and working out where how they group together, how close they are, and where the fragmented parts are, things like that. So then these parameters define those processes. So we produced a table like this for the national networks, and then a modified version for the local networks. And then we get to the input data. We had a whole range of data sets, priority habitat types and bog restoration habitats. We had the soil data, we had elevation data, designated site data that contained some information on habitat types present. And all these data sets needed to be assessed for spatial extent, for reliability, and for the different types of attribution that we could use. They also came in a variety of different projection systems, and so they all needed to be standardized. And we had to do some data summarization as well. So, for example, the MVC vegetation data was really, really useful. It's very, very complicated. So it needed to be summarized, for example, just grouping into calcareous grasslands versus acid grasslands. And the same with the woodland data. Then we needed to amend the Natural England FME workbench. So we needed to have a good review of how well it worked and make sure it was compatible, it would accept the new input data sets. But also it was important that the workbench, the process that runs the habitat network creation could be used by partners, by other users. So we did some work on amending the FME workbench to make it more user-friendly, a bit easier to set up and run. For those of you who've never used FME, this is what it looks like. It's a kind of spaghetti nightmare, but it's quite a complicated process. Once you delve down into it, it's very, very structured. So the first part deals with data input. It calls on all your different folders and reads all the input files. Then we have a bunch of processes there on the right that selects the parameters. Then the next part deals with all of the buffering. We have a process that converts all the polygon point line data into rasters to make the processing faster. Gets converted back to vector. And then all these calculations happen to determine where the clusters of habitats are and where the fragmented parts are. And they finally get assigned then to the different output classes, primary habitat, associated habitat, and such like. And these are the outputs. Here's the bog habitat, just as an example. For the national networks, we produced habitat networks for 20 habitats. For the local networks, for Ards North Down, we produced 14 habitats, and that's because we did not have input data for the other habitat networks. Those habitats just weren't present in Ards North Down. We also produced the group networks and supply the FME workbench and the schema mapper master rule bases. So I will show you some of the different maps just to show you how they vary here. Here we've got acid grassland on the left, and we've got bog then up in the corner, and you can see that they overlap because habitats can be important for more than one habitat type. Just because a habitat is it's a supporting habitat, an associated habitat for bog, it can also be a really important associated habitat for acid grassland. So this is where we need to start to think now about very carefully about where we want to change things, where we want to restore things, how we want to create our habitat networks. How will it impact on all of the other networks? Is the action we're taking for one habitat going to be deleterious to another habitat type? So it's really important to view these in combination. Here we have ancient semi-natural woodland. We can just see the fragmentation issue there. Calcareous grassland. Coastal sand dunes. Shingle. I'm just gonna go through these pretty quickly. Fen and heath, just to give you a flavour for how they look and how they differ, and similarities between them. There we go, limestone pavement. maritime cliff and slope. And to support this, we actually ran an analysis of some elevation data to produce an input data set of cliff areas. More grass marsh pasture, ponds, rivers, traditional orchards, wood pasture, deciduous woodland. And you can see the contrast here with deciduous woodland. There are pretty low areas of primary habitat, but huge potential there for woodland planting because there were no soil constraints. Here's a difference between the national and local networks. On the left is the national network, and this is around Belfast. You can see there's a big hole in Belfast because the urban area was clipped out. And we didn't have any woodland data going through the city. But then for the local network, we incorporated some local data on street trees. They were point data showing the different tree species and their condition and age. And you can actually see how important some of those urban places are for maintaining connectivity throughout urban areas once you go into that level of detail. We can also see differences between the national and local habitat networks here with coastal salt marsh. We can actually see that there's part of the network enhancement zone disappears in the local network in Ards and North Down, and this is because for the local network we had access to more detailed, we used some flood plain information that wasn't available at the national scale, so it allowed us to be more precise in the requirements for this habitat type. And we can see the same thing for reed bed here. We can see that the local habitat map for reed bed is much more constrained, because we were able to be more precise on the soil and topography requirements. So some limitations of the data. Obviously, if it's not in the input data, it won't be reflected in the habitat maps. So once new data becomes available, the habitat networks could and should be updated. We also need to understand how the data was collected. Does the data come from MVC survey? Brilliant, but how old is the survey? Was it surveyed this year? Was it 5 years ago? Was it 20 years ago? Was the data derived from remote sensing, like from Corrine? How accurate is the data? What are the strengths and weaknesses? All these things need to be considered. Also, particularly for the local networks, we need to think about, was the input data a polygon? How well was it digitized? Were they line features or point features? Because of the rasterization process, if you're working with single points for a single tree, it gets expanded to fill the entire pixel. So that can actually over-represent the value in some ways, potentially of a habitat feature. That's not potentially a bad thing, but you need to bear it in mind when looking at the outputs that this is how the data has been treated.
3 minutes, Gemma.
Thank you. Just the final point then is these maps are models, and before action is taken on the ground, we need to go out and check the conditions and check that what you're looking at is going to, or what you're planning is going to be suitable in that location. So I'm going to run through these last slides really quickly. Statistical analysis, we analysed the areas of the habitat networks, just to see what kind of land area of Northern Ireland we were looking at and what kind of land area was already protected. We masked out urban areas. We found that Northern Ireland currently has about 27% of primary habitat, but only 9.2% of that is protected very well, although 17.4% is covered by some designations. So if we strengthen the protection of designated sites, it gets us part of the way to 30%, doesn't get us all of the way. And we can see here for fen, we've got a low starting point in terms of percentage cover, 0.4% of Northern Ireland, but quite a significant potential for expanding the coverage of fen. But again, all this needs to be considered in, with the other habitats as well. Just to show you, these are the AOMB outlines. And we can see that if we protect areas in AOMBs a little bit more strongly, it would help a lot of areas of associated habitat, but it might not necessarily protect the habitats in the places we want to protect them. For example, you've got limestone pavement or calcareous grassland, some areas there that wouldn't be reflected. And just a quick snapshot of how we're using the data now. We are currently putting the data to good use for some work for Woodland Trust in Northern Ireland to provide evidence for woodland creation targets at national and county scale. We have this broad habitat network for woodland, and we want to really fine tune that to look at what would be good woodland planting targets. So thinking about where are existing areas of priority habitat. If we combine all of the habitat networks, we have a good idea of where the habitats are that we want to protect and don't want to be planting trees on. But we also have some additional input data sets, such as areas of peat. We want to be thinking about areas of agricultural land and also areas of coniferous plantation. And a quick sneak preview of some new data sets that we're going to be able to use in this modelling from James Hutton, things like topsoil phosphorus, topsoil clay, just to try to infer on land use from these data sets. And there's also predicted peat data set, which we can use to start adding some real world constraints to the habitat network maps to show us really where where it's possible, but also desired to plant trees or not to plant trees. I think I'm out of time, so I think I will just wrap it up there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gemma. That's fantastic. So please, everybody, and I can see there's a few questions that have already come in. Feel free to keep them coming through, and obviously we'll pick them up then during the Q&A, which will obviously happen just after Mark. So thank you so much, Gemma. That was brilliant. A whistle-stop tour of obviously months and months of work. So well done squeezing it into such a short 30-minute slot. I know it must not have been easy. So last but by no means least, we have Mark Wright here on the call from Northern Ireland Environment Agency. Mark currently leads a branch called the Conservation Science within the Natural Sciences part of NIA. His team aims to provide evidence to inform nature and geoconservation action and report on status of the special features on designated areas. Mark's background is botanical, mycological, and habitat survey and monitoring work. He has prepared citations to support the designations of some of our top nature sites, including our SACs, and developed the current monitoring protocols together with his colleagues from GB. More recently, Mark has been involved in the management of several strategic partnerships, such as with CEDAR, to deliver important evidence to inform actions. Returning to conservation science after a spell leading the other branches, he had instigated some thinking on our approach to designated sites and their part in the vertical proposed nature targets going forward, most notably 30 by 30, which obviously has been touched upon several times already. So a really quite a nice way of kind of almost linking up some of the stuff that has already been kind of picked up by both Jane and Gemma. So thank you very, very much, Mark, and please fire away.
Thank you, Nina. I just, can I do a sound check? Can people hear me and see the screen?
Yep, all good, thank you.
Everything's working. Well, I suppose just thank you for the introduction, Nina. Some of you will have heard the previous talks, and clearly I haven't been doing enough for the past, not say how many years, but I suppose what I want to do today is really to tell you a little bit about a kind of a planned review that we're in the middle of starting and getting going around designated sites. But I thought what I would actually do I suppose pose some questions and kind of get us thinking. If we were all in a room, I would probably ask you a question now, and to take a look at that screen and tell me what you see. You may want to put some stuff in the chat box. Unfortunately, at the minute I can't see the chat box, so this isn't going to work as an interactive thing. But I want you just to think very quickly about what you see in that image. And I'll try and read your mind by giving you some suggestions. I can see a lake or two, and I can see some gorse, and I can see lots of fields, and the fields look like they're growing grass to feed herbivores which we eat. That's my summary of what I can see. I'll show you another one. What do you see in this image? This is somewhere else in Northern Ireland. I can't see the chat box, so you can be saying anything you like. But I can see some forestry. I can see some areas which are a bit brown. Not sure what that might be heath, might be bog. I can see some green areas which are clearly agricultural fields or within land parcels, and I can see some sort of light greens. So yeah, just a bit of food for thought. Go back to the first image and I'll put some lines in the map. 3 areas of special scientific interest have got red lines around them. The one on the right-hand side has a lake in the middle. And so I suppose my question is, are these islands? Could they be a network? Are they functionally connected? And I have no idea to the answer to that question. But they're SSIs nonetheless. Go back to the second image, or here let's just zoom in on this one. So I flick back. I'm zooming in on the top left-hand corner here. You can see a tiny little fen site on the last talk. We talked a little bit about fen. There's a tiny little site. Definitely a nature island in my view. Is it sustainable in the long term? There's an interesting question. It is surrounded by quite intensive grass production, as you can see there. And back to this other image in Fermanagh. It's covered in red lines. I think there's about 5 biological ASSIs in that image. So it's very well designated. Is that ecologically connected? Is that a network? Is that better than the first image? Is it approaching a network? And I think the answer to that really depends on your starting point. It depends a little bit on your philosophical position, your ethical position, perhaps. So yeah, just a couple of sort of images really just to get us kind of thinking at this point. I suppose what I want to do really just in this talk is give you a little bit about, tell you a little bit about our journey with ASSIs, areas of special scientific interest. So outline a little bit where we've come from in Northern Ireland, a bit of the story along the way, and really about building what we believe is a need to just take a look at this again, and how does it fit within the post-2020 CPD targets, Leaders Pledge for Nature, etc. The United Nations Decade of Action, which is now only 7.5 years of action, if I've done my sums correctly. So that's really what I'm proposing to do this morning, just for a short period of time. A brief history. It's been a while since we've designated any SSIs within the department. I think the last one was 2018. I could make lots of excuses about that, as you would probably expect of a civil servant. But there's been a focus on other priorities. The rollout of environmental farming scheme, for example, the preparation of conservation management plans, Brexit, perhaps, and maybe the lack of a target around it, in my view, and lots of sort of external factors as well. But interestingly, as we sort of moved through the first 200 days or so of lockdown, as one of the things we did notice was a bit more positivity about the environment, and that's because people were getting out into it, and so on. Maybe it was just the weather was good, I don't know, but it did lead to a series of questions, and there was a particular assembly question where the minister indicated in his response that we actually needed to detail the sites needed to complete a functional and sustainable network of designated sites. And I suppose I want to think about those words network together with the word functional and sustainable. And this really aligned well to much of the thinking that was going on within GB and so on. And Jane has actually outlined some of that earlier on this morning. So yeah, network that was functionally sustainable and about reviewing it. It's easy to focus negatively on the past. It's easy to talk about what we didn't do. But what I want to give you a flavour about is what has actually been the case. There was a thing called Areas of Special Interest, ASIs, and they derived from the Mindy's Land Act in 1965. I don't know whether anybody in the audience is old enough to remember. I don't. The Nature Conservation and Midlands Order came in 1985, and with that there was the sort of statement in law that the department may make a declaration. And at that stage, it was envisaged that really it would be a rebadging exercise of the ASIs, and it wouldn't take that long. But it really became clear very quickly that actually there was a major program of evidence gathering required. And I suppose it's important to note that at that stage, SSIs were really predicated on them being representative examples of what was already in the wider countryside. And that was a big assumption, even back in the 1980s. Just sort of moving on, following the Habitats Directive in '92, there was a target called 2001. It was developed, it was published in 1993. And 2001 was the year that was promised to the House of Commons. That would be our target for completing the programme. And it won't take a genius to realise that target wasn't met. So there you go, it wasn't met. But interestingly, in that target, part of the mission of it was for an SSI network comparable to GB. And the target was about 8%, just over 100,000 hectares. And it did talk about a network, but it wasn't really clear what the word network meant, whether it was a series of islands or something more ecologically meaningful. We had the Environment Order came along 2002. A variety of changes in the legislation, notably that the department shall make a designation, so it moved from may to shall. And a document which I personally think was a shame never got published was a document called the National Heritage Vision and Strategic Plan, which we worked on and it was used internally from about 2012. And in that document, we talked about sites being at the core of a functioning network. And really that was building on the Lawton thinking that it just sort of come into play at that time. I think it was a shame that wasn't published, as I think it would have helped push things along. We've had audit reports. We've had health checks. We've had various internal reviews before. Notably, one of the last ones in 2012 detailed the progress over the previous 5 years, and the aim at that stage was about achieving a complete functional network of around 500 sites, about 10%. And in all these internal reviews, particularly, and actually some of the external reviews as well, resourcing has been a common theme. So that's not a new thing, and I know Jane and certainly others have mentioned that already. But I'm a reasonably upbeat sort of a person, and I suppose excitingly this leader's pledge for nature and the radical embedding of that 30 by 30 target within the nature positive message, I think is highly positive. And I think it gives us a clear direction of travel. The ministerial endorsement of that is hugely significant. And my understanding certainly is that 30 by 30 will be an apex target within the biodiversity strategy and within the environment strategy. And it'd be interesting to pick up with Jane maybe in the future and her link with policy colleagues on that to move that forward. So really in conclusion, we believe that the time is right to actually review the network. Think about that word and think more broadly how it fits within this sort of broader context. So in terms of what we're thinking about reviewing and considering, we have a lot of internal discussions ongoing and discussions with colleagues across GB and the country agencies. Some traditional questions like, have we got all features represented? What is Northern Ireland really important for in terms of local versus internationally important? How do we approach some of the features type? Do sites work for all features? Do tiny little annual plants that move around, do they really work within a designated site? And it's interesting, we've talked about fens. What do we do with habitat types which are mid-successional? A fen wants to become a woodland. If a fen had a mind, it wants to be a woodland. So how do we look after, how do we designate for these sorts of things? And I think part of it, certainly part of it for me, rising to this sort of radical challenge is, how do we get a roadmap that gets us the 2% that brings us to 10 or 11% of ASSIs to make the contribution to 30 by 30. There are lots more difficult questions to ask. How do we create a site network which is climate proof? Is there such a thing as a climate smart designation? Can things move in and out? In terms of things moving out, is there a surrounding nature-friendly matrix for them to move into? And I think this really reflects that nature is dynamic, it's messy, it's fuzzy. And I know we've got lots of interesting models on the screen today, and I've seen the classic nature network model. But nature in reality is dynamic, it is messy, and it is fuzzy. So how do we get that to work? Should we be thinking about managing the whole network rather than just individual parts? And that would mean a massive change in how we do regulation, for example. So these are some of the questions that we want to ask and consider. And really then, I suppose thirdly, is how all this then fits within the larger 30 by 30 focus and the drive towards nature harmony, as it said, by 2050. The commitment in there is for a well-connected and effectively managed system of protected areas and OECMs. So how do we get to that place? One of the things I'm quite interested in, and we've talked quite a lot theoretically today, is this sort of role of what you tell people to do and what people do themselves, and the role of that sort of informal sort of opportunity versus something which is a bit more top down. I'm quite interested in that area. Can you design this as opposed to a sort of more organic bottom up approach? And as people often remind me, you need a nature wildlife friendly matrix in the rest of the 70%. So it just isn't going to work. And one area that sort of I find quite interesting is this. I've called it neo-biodiversity. I don't think that's a thing, but I'm thinking here about all this sort of scruffy stuff around the edges. It's interesting that in the last talk we had a map of Belfast, which is where I live. That there are some hugely biodiverse places, but they're not what we would call traditional habitats. So I think that's an interesting area to explore. And I think finally, on the considerations is about what we communicate and how we tell people what it is we're trying to do. Nature is complicated. We talk within government about unfavorable condition on a site feature, but actually, if I was to take you and stand you in that unfavorable feature, it's still a perfectly stunning habitat. It just might have too many sycamore trees. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of how we communicate what we do. And I think part of that is actually providing the evidence and understand in an understandable way. to empower people and the various players to get on with doing what it is we need to do. I think Jane and others have alluded to this, that we need tools, we need frameworks to be able to deliver.
2 minutes, Mark, please.
No problem. And I think one of the things I think we need, particularly in Northern Ireland, is people need to be able to see this and experience it and understand it. And as most of you would know, if you live here, access is a problem in Northern Ireland. It's getting a bit better. But I'm convinced that access and people being able to experience and see is actually part of the solution, and that relates to democracy in action and people actually pushing things forward themselves. We've talked about resourcing already. I'm curious too if there are particular questions that the sort of folk in the audience have that you think we should be thinking about. I would quite like to hear from you, and let's consider some of those questions and see how we kind of answer some of them. So yeah, just to conclude, lots of money is needed. It's massive. This is massively radical. Just to get to another 2% to finish the ISSIs or ostensibly finish the ISSI program is hard enough. Although I do have some staff who are really up for it, but getting 30% is massive. It's also a huge opportunity. It needs to be driven by the evidence, as we've already said. And I think I'm convinced that we need to explain to people what it is we're trying to do. If you think about climate change, they've one metric, carbon. When you talk about nature, it's everything. And I think we didn't do more than talk. Lots of people are talking about this. I think we need some really good examples by the end of the year. Where I'm not at a meeting today to assess challenge fund applications. I managed to excuse myself and come to this, but I think there are some there's some projects in the mix which might help deliver something by the end of the year, and I think we need to catch the public imagination with this as well. And just finally to say, as I said before, feel free to feedback whatever questions and so on. And I think that's me. So thank you.
Super, thank you so much, Mark. I guess you did a great job at kind of just describing the kind of multitude, and obviously something that has been touched upon by the other speakers as well, and the kind of complexity that kind of surrounds this whole topic, and how we need to come into this from so many different angles, from funding to resourcing of expertise and staff, and the data and evidence that is required. So an easy peasy, isn't it, Mark? So I'll just put my presentation up again, but basically we will move on to the Q&A section. So I'll shortly pass on the torch to Catherine. But just to kind of remind ourselves in terms of how we want to go about the Q&A. So first of all, actually, if all the presenters, if you could please turn your cameras on if you didn't have them already on, because I can't see them at the moment with my presentation being up. So again, if I could remind the audience to use the Q&A functionality. And actually, something I forgot to mention earlier on, if you could please make sure to mark down who, or it can be multiple as well, you would actually like to pose your question to. Once the questions have been put up, there's also the option to press the like button, which I mentioned earlier on, which will obviously allow us to get an idea of kind of which questions are of the highest priority. So use that as well. So more than anything, really, if you're happy, I'll pass on the torch to Catherine. And I know we are a few minutes behind the schedule, but I know my kind of concluding remarks won't take that long, Catherine. So feel free to kind of run until sort of 20 past 12. So we can add a few more minutes to the end just to give us time to go through the questions. So if everybody's happy, I'll take my screen down and I'll pass on the torch to Catherine.
Thank you very much, Nina, and thank you for the time check. That's what I was going to ask you. We do have a plan, a little bit of plan in place now for our discussion. So I'm going to start with a very broad question for our panelists, and then we'll pick up some of your questions. And I have a number of additional questions noted down here. And then we'll have another concluding question for the panel. And it's been a huge pleasure for me to sit here this morning and write down a few reflective issues, which I would like to share with you at the end of the discussion. So let's start with a very general question for the panel members, and it's a forward-thinking one. So I'm asking you to imagine this world where we're up and running with networks. But I want you to think more broadly in terms of resilience, ecosystem services, monitoring. So what do panel members consider the key evidence needs to demonstrate progress and the effectiveness of network development? Nina, would you like to start with that one?
An easy one. I think as much as the habitat network maps are an incredibly useful place to start, they give us an idea of kind of what we have at the moment, and also the kind of potential for those long-term principles to be built on top of them. I do feel like we need to get a better understanding of, I guess, going back to what Mark was alluding to, what is the actual current status of our core areas and what our core areas even are in the first place. You know, obviously we can start from conversing about our protected areas, which are always kind of starting point, but what is the role, for example, of all of our individual nature reserves, as well as, you know, thinking about Ulster Wildlife, RSPB, National Trust land holdings, Woodland Trust land holdings, and so on. Are they actually able to act as these kind of core areas where obviously, or kind of like source populations for obviously our species to kind of spill out into the wider landscape? And I guess that is one of the kind of key questions, because there's no point in us kind of talking about the wider landscape really, or connectivity, if we don't have those functional core sites. So I think there's a big kind of research piece there to be done in terms of understanding of, I guess, how functional is our current network, but also kind of where do we have those core areas, and are they actually capable of acting as those kind of source populations for our species. And obviously only after that you can think about what's is our first priority the more and bigger and better, and only then the connected, or do we need to think about the kind of priority order between those based on that sort of information.
Okay.
Hopefully that makes some sense.
Okay. Okay, so can I move to Gemma, because I'm sure some of the countries that she works with are already thinking about this, so she might be able to give us some insight.
Well, I think it is really important to have a better understanding of site condition, especially for our most important sites. That is really, really important. I do think there's a danger if we focus too much on that. We don't make sufficient progress at the landscape scale. And I think it's wishful thinking, but we need to do it all. We need to do it all at the same time. We need to focus on getting more information about the condition of our existing sites, but we also need to be making new habitat, improving more habitat on the wide scale. So in terms of monitoring, it would be looking at the changes in extent of habitat, you know, that primary habitat, even if we're not absolutely sure that it's the best of the best. If we know that our habitat is actually on the increase, it is a good step towards supporting biodiversity and supporting connectivity. But yeah, condition is really important as well.
Okay, Mark, would you like to tackle that one?
That's a really good question, Catherine. Thank you. I suppose I see this as a number of layers in terms of monitoring. You know, what can we monitor at very big scale reasonably quickly and accurately, and the use of Earth observation technology, I think, is probably key in that. But you're only going to get a model, so you're not going to get necessarily real. We've got to remember these are kind of models. I think at a sort of a layer down, and it's interesting, Gemma, you mentioned protected site monitoring and condition. We have a draft program for government target, which is around condition on sites, and we have 20+ years of monitoring data of condition on sites, and some of that monitoring data actually informs the Earth observation. It informs the sort of building the rule base, and I would see that as a sort of a critical part of examining the detail in, I guess, the best bits, if you like. I think taking it a tier down, we need something which is rapid and relatively straightforward in all the rest, which actually tells us something. And there's a bit of development work going on this that's particularly related to an environmental farming scheme, and a few others where we need to be able to do rapid assessment. And actually, I think part of that is probably self-reporting in some instances. So the people who own the ground, work the ground, are actually able to report themselves, and that relates back to some sort of payment. I think there's also an opportunity for citizen science in this as well. I'm not sure what it is, but I think there are opportunities for citizens to be involved in actually and being empowered to be part of the sort of the bigger data, if you like. I wrote something else down. I think progress is important. And I do have minutes. This is potentially a wacky idea, and this has been recorded, so I've just said the word wacky, which isn't terribly scientific. I think league tables would work. I'm really interested in how social media works in terms of likes and trending. I don't use Twitter, but apparently you trend on Twitter. But I can see council, government, organisational league tables of who's got what done and where and how much of it and all of that. And I think that would help drive an element of competition. But as I say, it might be just a bit too far.
Can I just come back there and respond to Mark? Just on the Earth observation front, there are lots of opportunities for monitoring from Earth observation for rapid information, especially if you have a good baseline of what your habitat's like. It becomes easier to monitor, just as long as you align the metrics, appropriately. You need to know what you're looking for, what's actually useful, and understand the limitations and strengths of Earth observation. So for things like wetness or scrubbiness, you can really derive really useful condition metrics, but they might not be the standard condition metrics that your field surveyors are used to assessing in the field. It's a different terminology, but if you're interested in, for example, scrub encroachment, or is your hydrological restoration working, you can look at indicators for wetness. It's starting to think of in those ways of how Earth observation can work. But there's definitely a lot of potential to get regular feedback cycle, inputting new imagery with just standard metrics generated to provide that kind of information for a lot of sites that could really support field assessments.
Okay, so thank you very much for tackling that introduction. And Nina's coming back with another comment. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, apologies. So I guess one thing I kind of wanted to bring up as well is, I think, the need to kind of link up what we've kind of all alluded to already, is the role of, or the link between biodiversity and climate change as well, and how they both interact with each other, both in good and bad. And I guess for that as well, what I would love to be able to see and do is the kind of evidence base in terms of when we have these projections for climate change for Northern Ireland, you know, what's the potential kind of impact on that for our biodiversity, but more specifically for our habitats. We think about our habitat networks and building these, you know, networks. And so I think there's a kind of crucial need to understand, you know, where are our areas that are most vulnerable. So that would be a fantastic piece of work, I think, to be able to see in terms of kind of climate change vulnerability assessment for our existing habitats, but why not even for our kind of potential habitats as well, if we think about this kind of more bigger, better and more connected side of things. So just wanted to put that out there.
Okay, thank you. So now I will try and address some of the questions that have been sent in from the audience. So starting with Jim Bradley's one, which is around habitats. Are some habitats more suited to networks than others, for example, ponds or woodlands? If so, how and when does that impact on choices and decision-making for action? Who would like to start with that one? I think that might be one for Gemma to start off with.
I think there are very few habitats where all the species are completely dependent on one single site and would never ever disperse to anywhere else. So networks are important, I think, for all habitats, and not just the core habitat, but, you know, associated habitats. If you think about species that have different life stages and use different habitat types. In terms of how easy they are to map, they're very, very different. You have different levels of focus on particular habitats. For example, we're very, very interested in bogs at the moment, and there's a lot less effort going into mapping ponds and hedgerows, unfortunately. So the level to which we can model and map networks does vary because of the variation in the amount and quality of the input data.
Okay, Mark, do you have any insight into what you think the most important habitats might be?
That's a really interesting question. I think that's from Jim, is it? Yeah. No, that is an interesting kind of question. I imagine the answer is yes. Some habitats probably are more suitable. But I suppose I often wonder, and I suppose I've deliberately asked lots of questions today, and I'm going to continue doing that, because when one starts a process to investigate something, you just need to ask lots of questions. I think we traditionally are inclined to put lines around things. So we want to call this a grassland and we want to call that over there a woodland. But actually in nature, the two things don't really want a fence between them. They want to be able to ebb and flow, perhaps, or get a bit fuzzy around the edges. So I suppose when I'm thinking about a network, I probably think about a large range of things and a large, fairly dynamic matrix, which are probably quite extensively managed rather than been really sort of highly manicured and managed specifically for certain things, where you might be less bothered about how much of one thing there is as opposed to another thing, because you invariably get into an argument about whether the butterflies are more important than the grassland, than the woodland, but actually all of it's important. And I think in terms of networks and thinking about protected areas more broadly, it's this idea, if we're managing the whole rather than the individual bits, it looks perhaps much more dynamic. I'm not sure whether that's really answering the question, but I know in my head it's not about the individual bits, it's more about the larger thing.
Okay,
So,
Nina, what would Ulster Wildlife's perspective be on this question?
It's an excellent question, and I'm not. There's no sort of simple answer to this, and we've had a lot of conversations, you know, amongst the partners in terms of, you know, we have these maps. Kind of how do we move on to the next steps in terms of actually making decisions on them? And I think, kind of picking up from what both Gemma and Mark has just said, you know, I think it's so important that we don't just treat that these maps as the absolutes of this is what needs to go there, and kind of going back to what Gemma was saying about, you know, the overlaps between these maps as well, which kind of goes back to Mark's point about, you know, how our nature is and should be complex, and we should have a kind of trying to create kind of matrices of habitats as well. So I would very much like to see these maps as kind of decision support tools more than anything, and there's a lot more information that needs to kind of be added on top of that when it comes to our species priorities, when it comes to, you know, the ecosystem services again, and in terms of their ability to deliver for those. And I think that kind of goes back to what the question was in terms of about what's the most, are they all equally suitable for networks? And I would say yes and no, because it depends on kind of the angle that you're looking at it from. So a very neutral answer there. So I remember, for example, having this conversation with Gemma when we looked at the maps originally, and I remember looking at the reverse networks, and I guess that would kind of apply to some extent to peatlands and kind of other wetland habitats as well. That, oh, are these going to be useful at all? We just pretty much got some lines on where we have rivers and some kind of associated habitats. But then when you start thinking about, you know, that catchment scale and the kind of interconnections between our waterways and our surrounding habitats and so on, I think that kind of brings about that need for understanding kind of the interactions between those two. And while, let's say, our ponds and rivers and lakes might be more kind of restricted in terms of where they might be, they are still very much linked to the wider landscape when we think about our water quality, or with peatlands when we think about our carbon storage and you know, our kind of flood alleviation and so on. So I think we need to forget that it's not just purely about the habitats and the biodiversity as well, but as well as in many cases also about the kind of other ecosystem services that they provide, even though it's not that obvious. But yeah, going back to what Mark was saying, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we should never be kind of attempting to create these very kind of restrictive kind of approaches to this. And we need to be thinking about these kind of functional networks and kind of restarting natural processes, so that a natural state of environment is complex and it's completely or always kind of in flux. You know, this I guess change is very natural in the natural environment, so we need to acknowledge that when we design the approach in terms of moving from maps and design to actual delivery. So I hope that answers the question to some degree.
Well, I think that's a great introduction to the next question, which I'm trying to try and combine Judy's question in the chat with Owen's question in the question and answer box. So Judy is asking about nature recovery, and I understand our traditional focus on habitats and species. So Judy's question is nature's recovery attempting to recreate a habitat that was, at the time of designation, a snapshot in time, where the site was in a natural transition from one habitat to another? And are failing habitats now really just favorable examples of the site as it progresses through a natural succession? Now, the other end of the spectrum, Owen is asking us about, are nature recovery networks the same as rewilding? And you're beginning to go that way a bit in terms of talking about ecosystems and the ecosystem approach. So I'd love to hear people's ideas of where exactly we are on that gradient and where we're going. Are we moving away from habitats and species into a much more dynamic world? So perhaps we could talk with Gemma. Gemma might be able to, again, give us some insight into how we sort of merge habitats and species into dynamic ecosystems.
Merge habitats and species into diverse ecosystem. The habitat versus species question is difficult, isn't it? When you're working with habitats, you're taking a really broad view and then understanding that certain species may have very different requirements. That doesn't mean that you can't produce a more bespoke habitat network map or species network map.
I'm thinking of something even a bit more fluid than habitats, you know, to go to the ecosystem approach that people talk about.
The ecosystem approach. So what we're looking at with the habitat networks is trying to take that approach, though. And I think with the ecosystem approach, you're really looking at where action can support a wider number of goals. You're trying to balance a lot of different priorities. So where action for nature, first of all, what are your priorities for nature? What are your species and habitat priorities? Because you want to maximize your success, but also what are the other derived benefits that could be achieved? For example, in terms of water quality, there are often really good wins in other areas if you're supporting biodiversity restoration, for example, along waterway corridors and sort of managing soil a bit better. So in terms of an ecosystem approach, are we talking about monitoring here? Are we talking about valuing the existing services? Because a lot of the input data sets that we use to produce these habitat networks can be used also for valuing these other benefits.
Yeah. I know it's a tough question, Gemma, but I think you're giving us a masterclass in making sure you get the questions right at the start. So I think that's really good.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, this is a classic question, isn't it, about natural succession and the role of protected areas and how wild do we really get in the future? So what's your...
Yeah, it's a great question, Judy. And if you were to join any fieldwork team in the field at any point in time, it's a conversation that we would continually have. I had a conversation with somebody quite recently, and we were talking about this very thing. We were standing in the sand dunes at Murlock in County Down, and talking about why we want this to be sand dunes in County Down as opposed to woodland on top of sand dunes in County Down. And I think to an extent it's down. I think it's down to what we want. Because at the end of the day, in Northern Ireland, the entire country is impacted by humans, and everything we see around us, whether we think it's natural or semi-natural or highly modified, it's all as a result of human activity. So I suppose, to be sort of vaguely philosophical about it, it's really down to what we want. And at the minute, the current direction of travel is favourable condition on sites, and those sites and the features on those sites come from a fairly, what we might say, traditional approach to nature conservation, which sort of came in around the 60s or so, and that's about particular habitats which we as humans happen to value in terms of their nature value. So I don't know. I've now lost your question on screen. I've kind of lost my train of thought. And in terms of whether, are some of the habitats failing? Are they just because they're succeeding to something else? That's true. And I think I've used the fen example. Perhaps a good way to manage fens is just to go and dig lots of holes in the right place and create new open water.
The shade has
but I think for some habitats, it's actually the damage that's been done by an external factor like nitrogen or whatever. That's the reason for failing condition. Sorry.
Sinead has come in with another really good add-on, actually, the question around natural processes. So she's asking, will NRNs allow natural processes to occur outside designated sites, and to give us the freedom to move away from gardening designated sites? Is that the world we're looking at?
I think I'm still off mute, so I'll just jump in. That's a good question too, Sinead. I think these are the sorts of questions we want to examine in a review of sites. Do we move towards a system where we're managing a whole system? So that might be at a local scale, and I mean half a county, or it might mean Northern Ireland, or it might mean the north of Ireland. That might be the scale we have to do some of this at, where you're more interested in the functioning of the whole rather than the individual bits. But as Sinead will know and others will know, it's a radical shift in terms of how you regulate and how you make it actually happen on the ground. But I think that's the sorts of territory we're in terms of the questions and how we look at that. Yeah.
Okay, Nina, what's your perspective on this discussion around protected areas and areas outside protected areas?
Well, I would very much like to build on what Jim and Mark have already said. I think the challenge here is what Mark just referred to, as in, if we think about kind of facilitating this natural succession and change, how do we monitor and still kind of get an idea that nature is thriving? Because obviously that's kind of, I guess, and I think Heidi made a comment there on the chat there, that our goal more than anything at the end of the day with nature recovery networks and nature's recovery more widely is on, we need to do things that allow nature to thrive, right? Going back to the original question, which was about, are we trying to recreate something that used to be? I think it's a useful reference point. I think there's a lot of value in kind of understanding what might have been and what could be in the context of kind of facilitating nature's recovery in terms of kind of what the natural processes might have been in an area. For example, especially when we think about, our waterways and, traditional flooding patterns or of a river, for example. I think there's a lot of value in kind of referring back to how things used to be. It doesn't mean that we are necessarily wanting to go back exactly to that point. That can be very much a faulty approach as well, but I think there's a lot of use in understanding, if kind of looking at it from the angle, if we weren't here, what might the land turn into, sort of a thing, to kind of get that context. And I think the other question was about kind of rewilding, and I do think that there is a space for rewilding in the conversation around NRNs, but it's never going to be, it's not equal to NRNs by any means. But it again goes back to the kind of our potential kind of land use strategy and how we kind of zone our land. There might be obvious spaces where there is kind of things in place which would just allow a natural succession and rewilding to take place, but that's not going to be relevant in every single context, especially when we think about our urban areas, which are equally important in terms of helping to make our landscape more permeable for wildlife. But yeah, I guess the challenge is, like Mark said, that we are starting to acknowledge the fact that our protected areas, our nature reserves, that have been designated for certain things, but can we continue to manage them for those specifically, or can we make them more flexible, especially in terms of, what we face with climate change? And I think that kind of goes back to the whole kind of thing I touched upon now, but in my earlier comment as well, about and I guess that's something I want to challenge us on, and I'm trying to get my head around as well too, is, you know, if we were to able to manage to kind of aid natural processes and understand how they function, wouldn't those be the most sort of long-term and sustainable habitats if they functioned on their own, you know, without us having to constantly manage them? And obviously that's not going to be an appropriate approach to every single site, but kind of acknowledging that that should be our aim as much as possible. And that goes back to the kind of whole ecosystem approach. And I think what Gemma was referring to is that I do think that it's kind of what we're trying to do in some ways. Obviously, the kind of habitat networks are the kind of crucial backbone in all of that, but we need to start understanding what the kind of additional layers on top of that are as well, in terms of, you know, our species needs, for example. And that obviously then again can potentially aid us in terms of making decisions in those more local contexts, in terms of, oh, might we look at rewilding here, or might we actually want to create this hedge here that will help these species, because that's kind of, let's say we have, you know, bats in this area, for example, and they need that connectivity and so on. So it's quite a complex picture, but I guess the kind of need for that understanding of the complexity and change is hugely important. But going back to what Mark was saying, how do you monitor and track that is hugely complicated. And I don't think anyone really has an answer on that at this point in time, if that makes sense.
Okay. So before we conclude this discussion session, there is one very useful question which somebody I hope will be able to answer. When will the maps be available outside the project? It would be very useful, in particular for local councils, to have access to them. Who can answer that for me?
I guess that would be the answer one for me, or a question for me. So the answer to that would be that the vision would definitely be that these maps, or potentially kind of follow-up versions of these maps, would obviously be utilized in decision making. Obviously, that's always been the aspiration, but I don't think that we are there yet. I think we're, as a partnership, are very much acknowledge the fact that this was very much the first attempt at these maps, and that's part of the reason why the work that Gemma was involved in really kind of included that kind of piece of work on actually giving us the model, or the framework, which means that we can rerun the maps. So we're quite aware basically of the fact that this had never been attempted in Northern Ireland in the first place, and this was the first attempt. They are brilliant already in their current format, but we need to learn a little bit more in terms of what they're capable of doing and what they're not capable of doing. What are those additional levels of information we might need to add on to that, and kind of giving that guidance around how they should and should not be used. And I don't think we are there yet, but as a kind of long-term aspiration, the answer would definitely be yes, because obviously there's no point in these maps just sitting at, you know, Ulster Wildlife or any of the other partners. So that kind of goes back to what Gemma referred to as well, as that kind of follow-up piece of work with Woodland Trust. We've tried to kind of make those maps available for these kind of additional pieces of work within the partnership, just so we can kind of test out their usefulness, and they've been tasked very much so to kind of feed back to us in terms of how it goes and kind of what those limitations and caveats might be. So that's kind of where we're at this point in time, but obviously we need to kind of think about the kind of long term as well in that context.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that, Nina. Right, so I'm going to give you a day to recover from this conference. Well, I'll give you a weekend. So you have to come in on Monday morning and you have to decide what your top priority next step is going to be. So I'm not sure if it's fair to ask Gemma that question, but maybe we can come up with an answer. What's the next step in terms of data and mapping for nature recovery networks?
I can have anything I want. Can I have hedgerows, please?
And funding is no problem.
Yeah, detailed hedgerow map, please.
So,
The data that will allow us to do this, something like, you know, nice all Ireland LiDAR data.
okay.
Needs to make a hedgerow map, please.
Okay, so hedgerow maps are the top of your list. Okay, thank you very much. Mark, what's your top priority on a Monday morning?
I'm not a massive fan of Mondays, Catherine. No, I think for me, it's been really useful, I suppose, sitting in today and putting the presentation together. And thanks, Nina, for sort of badgering me into agreeing to come along today. But I think what it's done is actually just help focus sort of my sort of personal direction of travel and just trying to move this site review thing on. I think there are lots of questions we need to think through and begin to answer. And I suppose my priority is moving that on. So it actually does happen and doesn't just become a board talk. I'm tired of talk.
Okay, Nina.
I'll mute myself. That might help. So, I would agree very much on what both Jim and Mark have already said. I think kind of one of the big lessons for me as having been part of this project and involved in this conversation about NRNs is the fact that there is, I think, a universal kind of agreement across Northern Ireland that this is the kind of direction, even if we don't have all the answers yet, we should be going. And I think what I would like to see happen is that kind of shared commitment in terms of, yeah, so we're going to make this happen and we're going to actually, you know, sit down and all come together and kind of build a framework around this, as much as it's easier said than done, and obviously, but that was obviously part of the reason why this project was put together, to kind of come up with some of those original kind of answers and questions equally on that. So what I would like to see is really to kind of in the long term, that if we were to have all the money in the world, that we could put a team together to actually, you know, bring all these stakeholders together and have a look at where do we all individually have a role to play, kind of going back to that Slido there that we had, where so many different you know, members from the attendee list said that we can do this, we can do that, you know, to have a team almost to come together and kind of build this framework around NRNs for Northern Ireland, and where everybody has that role to play, whether it has to do with the design or the actual delivery side of things. But obviously that is that would involve a lot of money and a lot of commitment from a lot of organizations, so it's easier said than done. But I guess what does excite me is the fact that, you know, we have some really important kind of commitments for 30 by 30 and other things that will be coming through, but also we have the kind of policy support in terms of, you know, nature-based solutions in our climate change legislation and so on. We need to take advantage of that kind of momentum and also that appetite that is there. It's a huge opportunity, like Mark said, which I think is extremely exciting. But then going back to kind of what Jane made a comment on, that there needs to be that kind of coherent approach. So for that, we need to all come together and work on that framework. And it needs to be a very much a kind of, let's meet in the middle, you know, from grassroots to, you know, the kind of high level coordination and kind of strategic level and policy support, kind of supporting all that from the top. So it needs to be a very much a kind of meet in the middle sort of a thing. So easy peasy, my favorite word today, but that's kind of what I would like to see. But obviously there's a lot of little things that would feed into that, going back to what Gemma said about, you know, evidence needs and data needs, but there's a lot that we can, I think, already do and get on with already at this point in time, even in the practical terms on the ground. When we think about the likes of, you know, peatlands, we can take action on peatlands without really hindering long-term plans on NRNs, in my opinion. So there is a lot that we can get underway with already, because it is quite an urgent case, really. We need to take action for biodiversity, not just climate. We need to bring them all or both on the same level on our agenda, I think.
Okay, thank you. So just to wrap up our discussion session, I want to say thank you to Gemma and Mark and Nina for trying to answer the questions. I'm aware that there are some questions we haven't had the opportunity to answer, but I think it's also evident that these sort of conversations have to continue in the future. So I'd just like to end with a few reflections. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to be sitting here this morning, listening to what's happening in Northern Ireland. And these are very much personal perspectives, you know. So I think we would all hope that there'll be a fully functioning executive soon. With draft plans have been seen, and I think maybe priorities could be agreed if there's going to be a wait for a final publication. So again, in terms of moving along to next steps, there's been a few references to resources, but not very many, but equally that's an absolutely crucial element. There seems to be an expectation around public funding, that's quite understandable, but maybe there's an opportunity to explore more private sources or novel economic models, which some of the other countries, in particular Scotland, are thinking about. I've picked up a key challenge around integrating legislation from a wide spectrum, you know, not just nature cover networks, but there's air pollution, climate change, etc. And how can all these actions be most effectively bundled together? In terms of monitoring, there was a message around knowing the condition of our protected areas and coming up with a way of modeling or monitoring network development, in particular change in extent of habitats and how Earth observation might play into that. It was very striking to see advocacy and evidence and data coming out so strongly in that Slido too. And there was reference to citizen science. It's absolutely crucial in this world of varying qualities of data and information to make sure that messages are supported by strong science and evidence. We all appreciate the importance of partnership working. I see a very strong partnership community here, but I would encourage you to think outside the box. I think COVID has taught us some useful lessons. People appreciate their natural environment and nature even more. You could think of involving the heritage community, museums in particular. I know of some really fantastic community gardens which are producing food, supporting pollinators, and giving their food to food banks. So we can have environmental democracy here. In terms of data for habitat mapping, that's a crucial issue, but it does seem quite complicated. We had a useful reminder of the importance of soil and other components like phosphorus. And I think action needs to be taken in combination for various habitat types. So, you know, trying to get this ecosystem approach going. We had, Gemma was telling us in particular that there was a challenge to keep the data updated, but it was good to hear the recognition of the value of NVC data in particular, but it must be recent, must be kept up to date. And we also had a very important reminder that these maps are models and they need to be ground rooted and assessed as if for their feasibility in local communities. I've put in the chat box the link to a useful British Ecological Society report on protected areas and nature recovery. You know, when you have been in conservation for a couple of decades, you realize that routinely protected areas are brought around again to be scrutinized, quite rightly so in a democracy. But I think they are set to remain a core part of our approach to nature conservation. And our treatment of them must be very careful to make sure that they're resilient for the future. But perhaps it's the right time to revive this natural heritage vision in Northern Ireland. And I wish you all the luck with that. There'll always be questions and there'll always be more things to know about them. And then to conclude, I am a conservation optimist. You've a great opportunity here. You've got a whole series of things lined up. Leaders pledged for nature, 30 by 30 focus, EU legislation. And there is a bit of tension between the discussion around biodiversity and climate change, but the challenge is to bring those two absolutely global crises together for the benefit of the environment. And I think that's a great mission of us all that'll keep us going for quite a while longer. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Nina now.
I think those were excellent reflections, Catherine. Thank you so much for, so excellently managing that Q&A as well. It really helped us out and managed to kind of keep that kind of clear focus on or kind of like a narrative throughout, which I thought was just brilliant. So thank you so much for taking the time, Catherine, and we'll obviously see you again next week. I'll just bring my slides up one more time and just make some closing remarks. If I will manage to share, move my screen on successfully. There we go. So hopefully we are not too far, or we haven't got too far away from our original timeline. So I can release you all for lunch very shortly. I do hope really that you've enjoyed the webinar. I think it was extremely interesting to get a bit of a kind of a status update, I guess you could say, in terms of where we are with nature carving networks in Northern Ireland at the moment. Obviously, this was all quite high-level stuff. So I hope the session next week, which will be about more kind of individual delivery mechanisms in more detail, will be actually a really interesting kind of follow-up from this. So I hope many of you will join in on the second session as well. And again, this will be a very kind of Northern Ireland focused session as well, just like today. So please feel free as well to share those details, and I'll send a follow-up email as well with any of your networks, because obviously the more the merrier as always. And if you haven't joined up personally yet, please do so. Again, huge thanks goes to Catherine and all the panelists and speakers today for taking the time. I know we all have very busy schedules, and it's always daunting to put yourself forward on a panel. So I do appreciate your willingness to be on there. I know it can be quite daunting, but more than anything as well, thank you everybody in the audience. It was brilliant to see the numbers on the call today, and thank you for asking all of those questions. I think they were fantastic. Not easy, but fantastic. So let's keep the conversation going, whether that's on Twitter or whether you want to feedback anything back to us. Just feel free, obviously, to email me as well if there was anything that you felt was said wrong or that was interesting. Feel free, obviously, to contact me at any point on my email there. And do feel free, obviously, to interact with us on Twitter as well. I will endeavor at the end of both of the webinars to kind of send out a bit of a kind of follow-up with all the links that were shared in the chat. So don't feel like you need to be kind of copying them all over from the chat at the moment. I'll make sure to send those through. And lastly, really, I would really like to thank both our funder, National Heritage Lottery Fund, and all the partners. Really, it's been fantastic to work on the project, and we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for all of us, including our funders. So that has obviously made all of this possible. So I do appreciate all that support. And obviously, last but no means least, I do want to thank you, Rosie, in our hidden figure behind the scenes who've been working hard, you know, dealing with the chat and sharing all of those links. So thank you so much. You've made my life a lot easier. So thank you. That's been fantastic. So really, just to conclude, I'm really looking forward to, I really enjoyed today's session, but I'm really looking forward to the next week's session as well. So, which is obviously at this exact time on Thursday next week. So in a week's time. So I hope to see as many of you there as possible. Thank you very, very much. And I wish you an excellent lunch. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Nina. Good to see you all.
Thanks.
Likewise.
Bye.